Now that we have the basics of what it takes to be considered a civilization, let's focus now on the first known civilizations. The first civilization occurred in an area known as Mesopotamia. Today, we also know it as the Fertile Crescent. Mesopotamia ran from the Mediterranean Sea in the west, followed the rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris, and ended up southeast into the Persian Gulf area today. You will find that almost all civilizations existed next to or near some sort of water or fresh water supply. This was because water is needed to survive, as well as to produce and provide the opportunity for travel and trade with others. Let's take an even closer look at this region. Let's look at the region of Mesopotamia and its geography. Most of Mesopotamia is located in present-day Iraq. It also spreads west into the modern-day countries of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Because of how the rivers flow and the foliage of the land, the curved shape has led scholars to call it the Fertile Crescent. Fertile meaning that it's able to produce a lot of agriculture, and crescent simply referring to the fact that it's kind of an arc. Think of like a crescent moon. As I mentioned earlier, the Tigris and the Euphrates River runs through the region and provides water and transportation. One of the most interesting parts of the river is that when it would flood, it would do it unpredictably. After the water would recede or run away, it left a thick layer of a mineral called silt. Silt is great for agriculture. It's full of minerals that allow different types of agricultural products to grow very productively. The problem, though, is it was, like I said, unpredictable. Sometimes it would not flood, causing desert-like conditions. The solution used by the people would be irrigation, or the moving of water from one place to another. They would literally dig ditches from the rivers away from them into their fields where they were producing their crops for their agriculture. So they had to improvise if they did not have flooding in a particular year. The region of Mesopotamia was generally flat and didn't provide any real natural barriers for protection from outside warriors or sometimes even the weather. The solution for this was they actually ended up building walls around their cities. Makes sense, right? And finally, because natural resources were scarce, those that lived in the region relied on trade to get any goods or things that they needed, but were not able to be grown or created in their own area. So they relied on trade with other areas. One of the earliest successful civilizations that we know of was the area known as Sumer. Here we see it existed in the southern area of what is Mesopotamia, and it lasted from about 3200 BCE and up until about 2360 BCE. The people that lived in the region of Sumer were known as Sumerians. Makes sense, right? The Sumerians exemplified the 5 characteristics required to have a civilization. The Sumerians were a group of people that had developed city-states, which are cities that functioned like independent countries, but were as small as cities. They were independent from other cities around them. They would have their own leaders, their own set of rules and laws. They would be independent cities from one another, even though these cities might be somewhat near each other. Early on, government was controlled by a temple priest, or a type of religious leader. These religious leaders would have their central government in what was called a ziggurat, which is simply a place of worship. It would be like their town hall. The people would organize at the town hall, they would worship, they would talk about the concerns of the city, so it had multiple functions. Sometimes, depending on which city-states you lived in, a military leader would become ruler and pass his power to his son or other relatives upon his death. When leaders pass on their leadership to a family member, the family becomes part of a dynasty. A dynasty is simply a series of rulers that came from the same family. Because these city-states were so close to each other, people from different areas would mingle and trade ideas. This is known as cultural diffusion, or the spreading of ideas or products from one culture to another through conquest or trade. Excuse me. This is what a ziggurat looked like. A tall structure that acted as the center of town, as well as the religious center for the city. It's kind of like the city hall. Let's take an even deeper look at the Sumerian culture, just for a moment. Sumerians were polytheistic, which means that they believed in more than one god. Part of that belief was that when you die, you would go to the land of no return, as they called it, which was a dismal and gloomy place apparently. As we see that throughout the year, with most civilizations, the Sumerians had social classes. The hierarchy of power based upon your status in the city. For example, on the bottom, as you can see with the picture here, the slaves were the lowest part of society, but there was more of them than anybody. As compared to the top of the pyramid, where you'd have kings and legislators and priests. There were a lot fewer of them, but they had all of the power. A lot of that even continues on today in a lot of societies around the world, this type of pyramid hierarchical system. One interesting thing about Sumerians was the way that they treated their women. Women actually had more rights than that of a lot of later civilizations. One example is that women were able to get an inheritance and had the ability to own their own land. One of the first cities we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about is the city of which is another one of those small city-states. It flourished about 5,000 years ago and had reached a population of about 30,000 people. They had built up walls to protect them from other city-states who were looking to take their land. They used a trading system known as the barter system, where instead of trading for money, they would trade for goods or services. So if you have some, let's say some wheat to sell, and I have some goats that I don't need, I might offer you, hey, you can have my 2 goats for 2 bushels of wheat. They would trade product for product. That's known as a barter system. They would also practice religion and worship at the ziggurat at the center of the city, which we kind of talked about earlier. Here we see in the southern region of present-day Iraq. As you can see, it was located right next to the Euphrates River, which is still there today. This is an artist's idea of what might have looked like. It had a centralized area protected by walls, with the ziggurat inside as well. Outside the walls, you can see smaller dwellings and homes and shops as well. It was usually those people on the top part of that pyramid that would have the privilege of living within these tall buildings or within these walls. You might also kind of see that there's kind of a moat kind of around the area, which served as another type of protective barrier to keep enemies at bay if they would try to attack. As with most ancient civilizations, Sumer ended up being conquered in 2350 BCE by a guy by the name of Sargon of Akkad. Sargon would eventually create the world's first empire, which is the bringing together of several peoples or nations under the control of one ruler. Throughout our history, we will talk about many different types of empires throughout different parts of the world, and how these different leaders were able to bring all these different groups from all these different regions together under one leadership. One of these rulers would come from Babylon and go by the name of Hammurabi. He would create one of the first set of rules, standard rules, for an empire. These set of rules would become known as Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code was a single, uniform set of laws engraved in stone to help unify the diverse groups within his empire. And here we kind of see what that looked like. This is a sample of one of his, what's known as steles, which is pillars where he wrote his laws on. We're going to take some time later on to look at these laws and determine if they were actually fair, why they existed, and were they effective. We'll get to that in the next upcoming lessons. Though Mesopotamia would be the beginning of civilization, it wasn't long until others began to take hold as well. South and east of Mesopotamia, a new civilization was slowly evolving and would become one of the most well-known mysterious civilizations of all time. I wonder if you can guess what it was. And with that, we are finishing up our lecture on Mesopotamia and the creation of civilizations. I hope you enjoyed it. Looking forward, we'll be looking into Egypt eventually, but beforehand we're going to get a little bit into talking about Hammurabi's Code and this set of rules that he set up. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know as always, and feel free to go back to check out the video or any other type of resource you may need to help you fill in any extra blanks or to help further clarify anything you might not have completely understood. So with that, I'm done. And as one of my favorite authors would always say at the end of his lessons, stay awesome. Have a great day.